Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Become the Obvious Choice, Success, Profitability, and Finding Your Way. My name is Michelle Eisenberg, and I am a program assistant here at the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the Nasdaq Center is a nonprofit building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide by improving access and knowledge for all in entrepreneurship. So, as you will see in the chat in a moment, the NASDAQ Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So, definitely make sure to check out those links and resources in the chat. And then just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, let us know where you are dialing in from in the chat. We always love to connect. And second, we are going to open up for a live Q&A at the end of the event. So please make sure to submit your questions for us in that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try our best to get to all of them. And of course, none of what we do could be possible at the center without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Wells Fargo, the Nareet Foundation, Walmart.org, JP Morgan Chase, BPM, HubSpot for Startups, and Google Cloud. We are humbled by their contributions and hope you are grateful too. All right, so before we get started, we always like to launch a couple of polls just to step back, see how everyone here is doing today. This first one will ask, how are you feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? And we'll give it a couple moments for folks to respond here. Thank you, thank you. Awesome. We'll give it one more moment. Going once, going twice. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share these results. Awesome. We got optimism in the lead. Always great to see, but definitely some feelings of surviving anxiety and fear. Totally understandable. And hopefully, our conversation today will help alleviate some of those feelings. So, I'm going to stop sharing this poll and launch the second one. What is keeping you up at night? Is it finance, sales, marketing, scale, pivot, team, or surviving? And this one just helps us understand your current needs as an entrepreneur so we can ensure the programs and resources in development coming up are aligned with your needs. Awesome. All right. Who do we got in the audience? Toronto, Kenya, Dallas, Texas, Southern California, Seattle, Washington, Philadelphia, North Carolina, Minnesota, Oklahoma City. Awesome. I think that's Louisiana, Georgia, New York, Virginia, Germany. Awesome. Utah, UK, Connecticut, New Jersey, DC, San Diego. Awesome. Oh, so great to have folks here from all over. Spain, wonderful. Maryland. All right, I'm going to end this poll here and share these results. All right, looks like finance coming up in the lead, sales and marketing tied right behind, and some other needs here as well. So thank you all so much for participating, super helpful. I am going to stop sharing this poll, and without any further delay, please join me in giving the warmest welcome to our special guest, Jonathan Goodman, author of The Obvious Choice, Timeless Lessons on Success, Profit, and Finding Your Way. Jonathan, so excited to have you here with us today for this conversation. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Michelle.
Awesome. Well, before we just jump right into the conversation, would you maybe give, just 30 to 60 seconds on who you are?
Oh, wow. Yeah, sure. 30 seconds. I am a dad of two. I'm active. My background's personal training, so fitness, health, sports has always been important to me. But built a website as a personal trainer and self-published my first book in 2011. Started an online business that same year, and I tell people that I've had an online business before Dropbox existed. We were emailing Word documents back and forth. From then, geez, what have I done? 12 self-published books. I've put on 5 conferences, 8 digital programs, a certification, a mentorship. I've got a software platform, 3 membership sites. I've kind of run the gamut of like different business models that you can explore. And from that, been able to kind of distill all of that experience over all of those years and all of that technological evolution and synthesized it now into my ideal type of business, which is that obvious choice business, and that book that I just wrote.
Right. Oh, wonderful. Awesome. So to kick us off, I think one of the main themes in your book is, this idea that in today's business world,
Mm,
this feeling of needing to, utilize social media and go viral and
right.
is this kind of, the way for establishing your business growth? And so I, I'm wondering, what do you think has led to so many entrepreneurs believing that fame or going viral is the right path, especially when it comes to sales?
Sure. It's obviously context dependent. Surface level, what you're laying out, Michelle, is a reasonable assumption. Um, Social media's got reach, right? There's billions of eyeballs. It's dirt cheap. You can do it with a device that's already in your pocket, doesn't cost anything else. It always feels like work. Call it productive procrastination. You feel like you're doing something. And oftentimes, when we feel like we're working or feel like we're doing something, looking back in retrospect, we realize that perhaps we were working on the wrong thing. But in the moment, in any moment, it can be very deceptive. But then one of the biggest ones comes down to the metrics. If you understand the priorities of the social media platforms, their priorities may not align with yours, and that's one of the central theses of the book. Is that you have to understand what game you're playing, and neither game is better or worse than the other game. But the game of trying to build a business and perhaps leveraging online media is wildly different than the game of trying to become famous online as an entertainer. And again, neither game is better or worse than one another. But if you consider the priorities of the social media platforms, their priorities correspond to people becoming famous on social media. And so the metrics that they show you are all going to be comprised of, call it superficial engagement metrics, right? Likes, shares, comments. Now, those might correspond to tangible business outcomes, but they don't necessarily correspond to tangible business outcomes. And we'll probably talk about that in a lot more detail in a little bit. Not only that, though, and I think the final point here, Michelle, is that we all hear stories, right, of people who have gone viral or hit it and they became a massive success. Uh, Gymshark for clothing, for example. And what we don't understand is that there's an inherent survivorship bias in these stories, right? Outliers who succeed against all odds make for very good stories. But there's a difference in what makes a good story and what makes for a good case study. A story has to be something that we don't expect to work. And because it works, it then becomes a notable story. It worked against all odds, right? That gets passed on. Well, if you want a reliable case study, you actually want to follow foundational fundamental principles that we expect to work. And so again, stories can be entertaining, they can have lessons. Um, but a lot of the time, these massive outliers have so much survivorship bias in them. We don't hear about stories from people who did the exact same things and it didn't work. I
Right.
call that the outlier illusion in the book. And so, what this is all coming to is that when you use social media, and there's very good reasons to use it, especially early on in a business, you have to understand that it's a slot machine, it's not a blueprint. Um, it can supplement the meat and potatoes work of talking to humans, of shaking hands, of becoming the obvious choice to a few instead of the okay choice to many, which might come later. But it can't replace those foundational business principles that have always been the foundational principles, the timeless stuff. And so look at social media as a savings account, I think is a really good analogy. Um, you invest into it when you've got excess time and capital. You hope that it kicks off interest on in the interim, but you certainly don't depend on any investments providing you what you need for your short-term goals. You invest into it with excess capital and time and energy, in this case, knowing that it's going to compound over time, that you're going to wake up at one day in the future, if you've been consistent enough for long enough, that you'll look back and it'll have all added up in a way that's really quite magical and kind of hard for our lizard brains to make sense of.
Mm.
But we can't depend on that in the short term. What's the single rule for compounding? The most important rule is you don't interrupt it prematurely. You don't make withdrawals, right, prematurely. And so you want to start with deep, direct ties, not brand blasts. And that might change as you scale, but it's certainly not where you start.
Right, right. So much golden insight in there. And, something I'm just quickly curious about, for entrepreneurs you've worked with or businesses that you've observed,
Yeah.
uh, what have you seen in terms of like the way that this line of thinking impacts decision making and just the way that, maybe founders prioritize their time and how that might affect, outcomes there.
The hardest part about this conversation, and I knew this when I started to write the book, is that, and I knew that the book was going to take a fair bit of time to kind of catch on as a result of this, because everything with social media digs into the primal part of our brains. Um, Getting likes is very good for the ego, even though it's bad for the wallet. Um, and so that's why so many people are rich with likes, but poor with dollars. It's so hard to reverse against that, especially when all you see when you click on this little device in your pocket that is magical, like it talks to space and then comes back down somehow. Um, it, especially when you look at that and you think, hmm, is this really the most important thing that I should be doing? I see a question just pop up. Why is likes bad for the wallet? It's not necessarily bad for the wallet. Getting likes, getting attention is not necessarily a bad thing. But what's really important is measuring your the impact of the actions that you're taking based off of the tangible business outcomes that you desire. So, as a few examples, I measure the impact of my coaching business, of my social media that drives towards my coaching business, based off of how many inbound direct message inquiries we get as a result of the content that I share. I don't measure it based off of the number of likes. Bar Ape, which is a seasonal gelato shop, measures the success of their social media based off of how many people come in when they announce a new limited flavor. Right? They measure that. What I have noticed, and this is the pattern that I've noticed by and large, is that the types of posts that I put out that get the most amount of likes almost has an opposite impact on my tangible business outcome, which is getting inquiries and qualified inquiries for my businesses and for my services. And so you need them all. Don't get me wrong. There's three types of content you need within any kind of an account. There's value, there's viral, and there's depth. Um, at the beginning, you probably need a little bit more viral and value type content because you need to get some attention and then you need to provide value and do a call to action, right? But as your business grows, that begins to shift. You begin to go for much more value-driven content that actually drives tangible business outcomes and less viral because you probably have enough people. Like if you're selling enterprise level software, how many customers do you need?
Yeah.
Um, and are your customers going to find you because you hit a trend on TikTok? Like, probably not.
Right, right. It's so interesting, it's like it goes back to this idea of like this outlier theory that you're talking about.
Mhm.
And yeah, it can definitely seem very appealing, and there definitely is, value there in that viral content. But really, I love this idea of, just focusing in on like what are the goals that you're actually trying to achieve, and like
Yes.
how are you measuring success? And
I think
I
that's
love
the key.
yeah, yeah, really,
It
really. And
it's a
then
difficult conversation for precisely that reason. That
yeah,
it can work, but it doesn't reliably work enough to justify the amount of time that it's going to take you to get legitimately good at content. Like if you're doing content on social media and you're competing for attention with that content, you're not competing against other business owners that are selling the same types of things as you. You're competing against full-time entertainers who are probably going to be um, better looking than you, uh, have more money than you, and have been doing this much longer than you and have way more time. Like I've got a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old and a very pregnant wife. Like I simply don't have time to really dig in and figure out how to tickle the algorithm today. But others do. And
yeah,
so if I'm playing that game, I'm competing against them in that game.
totally.
Um, that's even if that's the best game to play. I would argue that it's not. But even if that's the best game to play, I'm not going to win it. And so it's not my best game to play. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having.
Yeah, love that. Amazing. And so I'm curious, what are some of the other, from this experience that you've had, some of the other damaging myths that you think business owners might internalize about, what it takes to really succeed in today's business world?
The biggest one is trying to figure out how to manage your own ego. Uh, Nobody you don't know is going to be impressed if you're going behind the scenes and organizing dinners with people in your industry as a way to network, for example. Nobody you don't know is going to be impressed by that. Um, and that's a very difficult mountain to climb because there's always going to be other people that are going to be thrust in front of your face at any given time that are going to jump on trends. And even a broken clock is right twice a day. You know, the type of person who chases a trend or a tactic or an algorithm hack or whatever, most people are going to miss it, but you don't see them. You only see the people who hit it. And at any given time, there's going to be somebody that's going to be hitting it. And it's going to be very loud, and you're going to compare yourself to them. But what I have found in 15 years of having a business online is that it's actually better to be the tortoise than it is to be the hare. Because the hare doesn't stick around. The hare is Icarus flying too close to the sun, right? What we compare ourselves to, though, and I think this is the central point, Michelle, is that we don't compare ourselves to an individual when we're comparing ourselves to other people online. What we do is we compare ourselves to what I call a representative conglomerate of individuals. We compare ourselves to whoever is doing well in the moment, not realizing that that person, in order to get to that point in that moment, probably had to do something that required trade-offs that you may or may not have been willing to make, accept risks that you may or may not have been willing to make, um, and sacrifice more, right? Maybe you do, right? Maybe you are willing to make those things, but in return for that, that person in almost every single case is not going to stick around for a very long period of time. But once they burn out, somebody else is going to replace them. And you're not going to notice that transition. you're just going to compare yourself to the next person who's in the spotlight, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so we need to look inward, I think, a lot more and actually say, what do I want? How do I work backwards? What are my tangible business outcomes that I measure? How can I work backwards from those outcomes and leverage whatever media is around right now? Understanding human psychology, which doesn't change, we'll get into that, in order to drive the type of life and business that I want, which might be huge or which might be meaningfully small. Both great.
Right. And that's such a good point and something, that we hear so much from, different business leaders across industries is, like it's gonna look different for every single person. So at the end of the
Yes.
day, how much value does that comparison really have in or how much influence should it really have in, your decision making and all of that. So
Yeah.
it's such a great point. Um,
Especially for people with families. Can we just talk about this for a minute? The amount of morning routines that I see, the amount of efficiency hacks, the amount of people promoting things like hustle culture. And then you look like even one step deeper and you're like, you've made a decision not to have children. Like, wonderful, good for you. I totally respect your decision. But we have to understand that good information for one person can also simultaneously be bad advice for us based off of their situation, based off of their backgrounds. Um, there is a notable pattern amongst a lot of the thought leaders in the business, call it hustle culture type information economy, which is that they are generally these power couples, right, are generally double income, no kids type people. Wonderful. Good for them. It's not for me, though. And so I think we just have to appreciate the source that the information is coming from and put it through our own filter and say, is that good advice for me based off of how they've decided that they want to live their life? Is that how I want to live my life? The answer might be yes, or it might be no.
yeah, that's such an interesting point. And I think as entrepreneurs are kind of, thinking about their own position, as a founder in whatever space they find themselves in. I love, just returning to this thought of, folk, continuing to put effort into looking inward
Oh,
versus
yeah.
outward and focusing on those goals. So wonderful. Um, to touch on something that you had kind of mentioned earlier, especially, when it comes to a lot of like the digital tools that we're using in social media, marketing today can feel inhuman. And so, to combat this, how might entrepreneurs, go beyond these metrics, likes, follows, clicks, whatever it may be,
Right.
and really tap into the human side of customer engagement to drive meaningful growth? Like, how might you recommend that founders really have those conversations that result in trust and insight that drives growth?
What a great question. It's so fascinating for me the more I've gotten behind the scenes of people who have really made a really big impact in their industry. Like what was it? I always used to wonder, there's so many people in every industry that are just pushing up what feels like this kind of invisible barrier. We're all smart. We're all working hard. Nobody now has information that nobody else has. So it's not a discrepancy in the information. That's all commoditized and democratized. So what is it that allows these few people to jump that line and everybody else just continually, just no matter how hard they work, just pushes up against it? And in almost every case, it's the stuff below the iceberg that nobody sees. Well, you get to know them, and it's actually the offline networking that they've done, largely based off of how good of a job they've done fostering connections amongst either people within their industry or people within the industry that they serve. There was a book written many years ago by somebody named Keith Ferrazzi, and it was called Never Lose. No, it wasn't Never Lose a Customer Again. Keith Ferrazzi. It was a book about networking. Never Lose a Customer Again is my buddy Joey Coleman's book. That's a different book. Also a great book. But Keith Ferrazzi, he told this story of it was an enterprise software salesperson, and I can't remember even what it was for, but it was high-end enterprise software sales, hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement it. But of course, in order to integrate this software into a company was a tremendous amount of effort on the company's part. And so what the software salesman was selling was not just to the budget committee, he was selling to these people and saying, "Hey, I'm going to make the company better, but I'm going to make your job harder." It's a really hard sale to make. And he grew into the best salesman in the history of his company. And he did it one way. You want to know what that one way was? He called up the CTOs of all of the companies. Yes, never eat alone. Thank you. He called up the CTOs of all of these companies that he thought that the software might fit in, and he invited them to breakfast. Because he realized that in most of these companies, the tech departments were very small. The CTOs was sometimes even the entire department. And these people didn't know one another. And they were lonely in their jobs. And so he said, "Hey, I'm doing a breakfast on Thursday at whatever, Nancy's Diner with 4 CTOs. So and so from this company is going to be there. You might know of that company. I'd love for you to join. Will you join us?" And he started organizing these breakfasts. And he'd sit down at the table, and there would be 3 or 4 CTOs from these different companies who didn't know one another, but knew of one another's companies. And he would say, "Look, I'm a fly on the wall. I'm not even here. My job's to pay the bill. You guys have at it." That was it. That was it. Because the sales cycles for these things is long. He needs to be the obvious choice when they're ready to integrate software like his. He needs to be recommended and referred. What do people do when they want new HR software and an enterprise solution? They're not going on TikTok to see what trendy music reel the person has made and be as impressed. No, they're calling up their buddy and saying, "Yo, I know you just implemented this tool. Did you have a good experience? Did you like that guy?" That's how this happens. That's how this has always happened. I'm trying to build a community of authors right now. Because I believe if you exist in an industry, it's your responsibility to become what I call a citizen of that industry. And so I pursue something that I call literary citizenship, right? And what I'm doing is I'm working with one of the biggest book influencers in the world. I'm basically funding him, almost like old school, you've got artists that you're funding, right? Like I'm almost funding him in order to continue. He's over 1 million followers, but he doesn't have any way to make money because he basically shares recommendations from books. What's he making? Like 15 cents on an Amazon referral, if somebody clicks on his newsletter. And so, but all of the authors want to suck up to him, and he has a great Rolodex of authors. And so I'm funding him. And then him and I are organizing author dinners and author meals across New York, Toronto, Austin, and then potentially Bali, just because I'm going to be there next year for a while. But I'll go to Austin. Him and I will set up a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner for 2 days straight. And then I'll do an intimate writing retreat for 3 nights. And I'll invite, you know, 7 or 8 people. And I'm paying for the whole thing. That's my marketing budget. Because when somebody wants a book, who do they ask? They ask people who like books. If you want to get somebody to buy books, find people who are already buying books. You go to the authors they're buying the books from. Everybody wants to be connected. Nobody wants to do the work to build connections. That's where the bar is set low these days. That's where the bar is set low.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting. And I love these, really, out of the box examples that, I think will really inspire entrepreneurs in the audience to think creatively about, innovating their marketing strategy in those kinds of ways, to build stronger connections, and just to dive a little bit deeper into the trust aspect. I know,
Sure.
something that you talk about in the book is, building trust through community, specificity, and familiarity. Would love to, just hear more about this, how these principles, how you've kind of seen them show up in practice, and why
Yeah.
you think they're overlooked, and what really makes them key to success.
It's so, I mean, what you just laid out, I call the trust triangle, right? Community, familiarity, specificity. It's the essence of word of mouth. Um, Over 90% of all business still happens through mostly offline word of mouth. If you don't believe me, look around you at everything that you have in your room, wherever you're at right now. Look at everything you own. Think of everything you've bought or people you've hired in the last week, right? Do you even know if any of those companies have a social media account? Let alone consume their content, let alone be convinced to buy as a result of their content. Um, a simple self examination shows us how insane our world has become when it comes to business and marketing. And so, word of mouth is, but the problem, of course, is that you can't really measure it. And we always put far more emphasis on things we can measure because it feels like it's work. It's easy in the short term, even if it's less effective in the long term. Peter Thiel, famous Silicon Valley investor guy, first investor into Facebook, wrote a book called Zero to One, and one of the main his core thesis there of building any business is the goal of any business is to become a monopoly as fast as possible. The quickest way to become a monopoly is to find the smallest available market to monopolize. Everything big that you see out there, we don't, unless you really read the case studies, you don't realize how small they started. Facebook started on the Harvard campus. PayPal started by selling to 30,000 eBay power sellers. Nike started with Phil Knight selling running shoes at weekend track meets out of the back of his Plymouth Valiant. I mean, everything starts this way. And the reason that everything starts this way is because when you are newer, you don't have as many resources. You will get out competed if you compete the same way. How do you beat Michael Jordan? Like, you sure as hell don't play basketball. And so, where can you play your own game? And that's based off of trust, right? Community. Can you go to tiny communities, weekend track meets, and sell your shoes out of the back of a Plymouth Valiant? Because I can tell you right now, Nike ain't doing that anymore. Familiarity, you know, big brands build familiarity with millions upon millions upon millions of dollars of brand based marketing. Well, you can't compete with that when you're newer. But what you can do is you can build familiarity in a very well selected, much smaller market. I tell the story in The Obvious Choice of Bolton Foods, who sells meat locally, organic, whatever, good meat locally, steak, sushi, great fish, whatever. They park their van in rich neighborhoods and they knock on doors and they say, hey, we're making a delivery to the neighbor. While we're here, it's cheaper for us to sell to more people when we're already here, so I can offer you a discount. Are you all stocked up with your steak, with your sushi grade fish? Costco can't do that. Costco can't do that. We trust the word of our neighbor, even if we don't know our neighbor, even if we don't know whether our neighbor is actually buying the service. Simply by virtue of if there's a van on our street, we assume a neighbor is buying that service. How can you recreate that digitally if you have a digital like software service, whatever? How can you recreate that then in small, tiny little bubbles? that you can exist online that are too small for the large incumbents to attack. And then as you gain more resources, you can expand outwards strategically, right? Maybe you park your van in a few different streets because you have now 5 vans,
Right.
physically or metaphorically.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love this. And I think, something we talk about all the time is this idea of like, identifying what your niche is or finding what your niche is
Yeah.
and really tapping into that market. And I think it's so interesting this thinking about it from this perspective of like, there are these big corporations that maybe you can't, compete with in the same way, versus they have big resources and teams and all that. But they can't tap into these smaller niche markets the same way that you maybe can. And so that's just really, really important, I think, for a lot of entrepreneurs to focus on as they're building out these strategies.
And the other element of that that I mentioned in the book, but I didn't mention just in that little monologue just now, Michelle, is it's also more profitable. It's also more profitable. I mean, when you sell online, you have to accept credit cards. If you sell in subscription type payments, you have to accept what's called card not present transactions. Your simple payment processing rate is going to be a higher percentage. You can't accept cash, you can't accept debit. Um, you have probably delivery expenses as well. Like those things can add up. I mean, the Bolton Foods example that I gave in the book, he asked me, I went to pay with credit card. He asked me if I could pay with debit because it saves him 3%. I did some back of the napkin math very conservatively. Me paying in cash and 9 other people that day paying in cash comes out to about $155,000 of extra profit for that company every single year. Straight bottom line. So when you're new in your business, cash is king. High profitability is king. Um, as you are bigger, perhaps you can absorb tighter margins. But when you're newer, yeah, this idea of selling through familiarity, community, it's actually more profitable as well, which I think doesn't get spoken about enough.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that is really interesting, and I think it is something for entrepreneurs to think about as they're, cash management is always, going to be an aspect of these
Yeah,
conversations, and so, really thinking about, how is this going to affect, the way that I can, spend money and invest
right.
into my business, and or continue to, grow with those funds, and so. That's so key. And so I know we're kind of coming up on our live Q&A here, but I just wanted to, I know you kind of have this four-step content creation framework focused on attracting customers, not just
Okay.
followers. Wondering if you can just quickly, walk us through how this works and what's different about this process from what entrepreneurs generally do today online.
This process keeps my head on straight. It's why I like it. Man, I've struggled with content over the years because I can do content. I can get stuff to share. I wrote a book called Vironomics. There was one point in my life where I read every single study that existed on social contagion theory with computer mediated communication. So I know how to make stuff go viral. I wrote a book on it, right? And I've done it for years and I built big platforms. But the question is why, and that's what I kept coming back to. And there's of course a time and there's not a time. And so I built this 4-step framework throughout a business's life cycle and entrepreneur's life cycle, more for myself to keep my head on straight. And so it goes like this. Step number 1 is you create it for yourself. Step number 2, for your customers. Number 3, for your industry. And then number 4, for the world. And so what's very, very important is to identify which stage you are in right now, because that's how you measure your goals with. That's how you measure your outcome with. Step number 1 is you create content for yourself as a way to learn, right? You don't care if anybody else engages with it. For the first 2 years that I had a blog, my mom wrote me a comment on the first blog post. I had no other engagement. But what I was doing was I was accelerating my learning as a personal trainer by forcing myself to teach that content, right? Teaching is at the bottom of the learning pyramid. You attain 80 to 90% of what you're trying to learn if you teach it to somebody else. And so that's a wonderful reason to make content, is to learn faster. Now, there might be a byproduct of that, which is somebody else might notice it. Great. But that's a happy byproduct. You can't measure your success or compare yourself to others. Step two is you create for your customers. And the reason that you do that is 80% of the benefit of content for most businesses is in the nurturance of leads, is in the retention of existing customers, is in how it can be used to generate referrals from others. And so you can get 80% of the benefit without the 20% that sucks of burnout and comparison. If you focus your content on your existing customers, that might be on a social media account, it might be a newsletter, it might be a podcast just for people who are existing customers of your business. Again, you don't measure the outcome of that, though, based off of how much superficial engagement you get on Instagram. You measure it based off of how many tangible business outcomes that's driving for you, right? Converting existing leads, retaining customers, getting them to buy more often or stay longer, and then can they use that to pass it along to somebody else, to refer somebody else? I think actually most entrepreneurs should stay at stage 2 for content for the entirety of their careers. But if you choose to go on to stage 3, that's when likes and followers and engagements becomes more important. Stage 3 is you start creating for your industry. And the reason for that is the people who actually are going to engage and share your content are not your customers. They are your fellow enthusiasts and the people in your industry. And what you do is you actually become a voice for them because they articulate what they believe and what they want others to know about themselves through your content. Because still 80 to 85% of people on social media don't create their own content, but they want to be heard. So they'll articulate what they want others to know about themselves through your content. Customers aren't doing that, though. Customers aren't finding you through this. And so what you do is you start to build an audience first, a fellow enthusiast of people in your industry. And then maybe at one point, very far down the road, you're like, I've had a tremendous amount of success. I'm really good at creating content now because I've been doing it for a long time. Maybe I can go into stage 4, which is thought leadership. That's where I'm trying to transition into now. I've been building businesses online for 15 years. I've written now, by my count, back in the napkin, about 17 million words online. And I'm just now getting to the point where I'm like, maybe I could make a dent in the thought leadership world. It's hard, and it should be hard. That's why reputation is valuable.
Yeah, yeah. I love this framework, and I think it's so important, absolutely, that you kind of start with this idea of creating content for yourself and using that as a way to learn. Like
Mhm.
you learn so much about what works, what doesn't work, your customers, yourself, and your business. And so it's just so key. It's you can't skip that part. Absolutely.
Right,
Um, and
right.
and I know, we have so many entrepreneurs in the audience that definitely aspire to be thought leaders in whatever space
Sure.
they're in. And so this is just such a wonderful framework for
And
kind of.
and and all along the way, absolutely put content out. Absolutely put content out. Work on being a better communicator. Work on meeting people who are doing the same type of thing as you and supporting them and lifting them up uh and wonderful, right? But don't lose sight of what's actually driving business today. Use that as your foundation and then invest like a savings account ongoing. And maybe you'll get to the point where you'll say, okay, I'm going to become a thought leader. But there actually, if you really pay attention to it, are very few, um, I would argue, no good examples of notable business thought leaders who still actively operate their businesses. The only examples that exist uh, that I know of are examples where the business actually went up in flames not too long afterwards.
Mhm.
And so what does that tell you, right? They either sold their business or they like, I don't operate my businesses. That's a trade-off to doing what I'm doing right now. I don't know of a single example of somebody doing that. Not one.
Right. And that just, yeah, kind of goes back to that whole idea of, not, focusing inward, not comparing, because there is that, those sacrifices that you had to make, and everyone has that on their own version of that. So
Yeah.
so wonderful. Jonathan, this has been amazing. We do have some time for live Q&A here. So if you're in the audience and you have a question for Jonathan, make sure to put it in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll jump right in. We have a question here. One benefit of social media is scalability. How does leveraging in real life connections and real social/business circles work to scale as effectively and build bottom line results?
Yes, scalability on social media is possible. I would argue, though, that scalability of real human connection is actually stronger and more impactful. Um, so I would have to ask you a whole bunch more questions and be a little bit Socratic as to your question, because I think there was a little bit lost there. Yes, you can absolutely scale with social media, with platform. Don't get me wrong. Founder-led businesses where the founder has a tremendous reputation is inarguably the most effective marketing that you can do today and very likely into the future. Um, there's a lot of scalability in that. But that doesn't happen from day one. That happens after the business is already successful. That happens in stage three, that happens in stage four. And if you actually go back to those stories, you will find that in almost every case, yo, that person was pounding the pavement. And so again, this is a question to me of like, where do you start versus where maybe you go at one point? Um, and you got to have something to back it up. There's a lot of people out there saying a lot of things that when you look in their background, you're like, well, you kind of haven't done anything yet. Um, so I would have to ask you a lot more questions on how you define scalability and what type of business you have, because I think there's just too much nuance in that for me to answer that properly. But my
Totally.
my grandiose answer is actually humans scale better than social media when you make the right human connections. Like when I was looking for other authors or people to blurb my book, for example, or people, it's like one really great connection of somebody that I flew to New York to meet and said, "Hey, I'm going to be in New York on Thursday and Friday. Can you get together for lunch?" And they said yes, and then I booked a flight. Like, so I was in New York on Thursday. Like that one connection is more valuable probably than 5,000.
Right. Right. Yeah. Because it kind of goes back to, the goals or the outcomes that you desire. And it's like, are you looking for, that strong, you know, client relationship? Or are you looking, maybe for like more followers or something,
Sure.
stronger engagement or something like that on those platforms. So that is, a question to think about there. So okay, awesome. We have another question here, and we knew this would come up. What is your take on AI generated content, or just,
There you
I guess,
go.
the use of, this in general for business success? Pretty soon all
Right.
creation and consumption will be AI generated and consumed, is what they say. What are your
I
thoughts?
will read you a text message that I sent to my literary agent yesterday. I said, I asked her, I sent her a message. I said, are any of your other authors talking about this, talking about AI? I'm genuinely curious how top of mind it is for others. And she basically said, actually, not many people are mentioning it yet. How are you using it? And here's what I wrote to her. I said, Think about it like you basically have God with immediate access to all knowledge of human history and the ability to distill that knowledge within seconds, willing to be your debate partner 24/7 and hold no grudges. I think that there is going to be a tremendous amount of slop that's going to be created. But I also think that with AI generative search, slop on the internet is going to be less of an issue because it's just going to get weeded out so quickly that it's kind of irrelevant. I think that those that learn how to work with the various AI platforms to create content, it's just going to be in a different universe than the people who are slow moving on it. Um, the difference between the book that I'm coming out with next year in January and the Obvious Choice book as a result of working with AI as a thought partner on this next book. Hey, what are my logical inconsistencies? Where are my blind spots here? Can you help me make this more practical? Questions like that. Hey, I believe this thing. Argue with me. Tell me why I'm wrong. Make me prove my case to you. Holy heck, it's powerful. Holy heck, it's powerful. If you use that as a partner, you will be able to create better and more work quicker in a way that's never existed before. Um, very few people are doing it right now. It's not about, hey, write me a blog article on 5 things that enterprise SaaS salesmen need to know today. No, that's going to be crap. But if you're like, I have this counterintuitive thought or framework, can you challenge me on it and help me really dial it in? Then it becomes really powerful.
Really, really insightful there. And I know everyone's kind of going to have their own experience with
Totally.
AI and still learning about all these tools that are out there and what they can do for you and which one's the right one for your business. But all great thoughts to consider there as well. Um,
I think there's a lot of in certain industries, and I felt this, right, towards writing. I think there's a lot of ego involved in certain industries, and people are almost like puffing their chests out online and trying to come off as like noble. Oh, I don't use AI. And you see ads like how to do this without AI. It's like, well, it's coming for every single career and profession pretty quickly. Um, I don't think it's going to be 5 years. I don't even think it's going to be 3. I think it's going to be 1 or 2, if I'm honest. And I think it's probably worth it, no matter what industry you're in, to take 10 to 20 days and really dive deep into figuring out how it can make you better, expose you to your blind spots, and uh, and even become a thought leader. Like a friend of mine owns a clothing company. Um, and they do like $30 million a year or something. And they're reassessing their flywheel. And one of the things that he was doing, he's here now in Mexico, him and his wife, so we spend a fair bit of time together. And one of the things that he's doing is he entered in the Jim Collins Good to Great framework. He basically said to ChatGPT, read this book. Here's a whole bunch of articles. Here's a whole bunch of case studies. Here's a whole bunch of frameworks on it. He built himself a custom GPT to be his business coach based off of the Good to Great framework, to ask him questions, to assess his business's flywheel, and to help him improve upon it.
really amazing.
Incredible. And he can do that at 10 o'clock at night
Right.
and get immediate responses. Uh, it's wild,
It
really.
is. Awesome. Jonathan, we're coming up on time. If had just one key takeaway or piece of wisdom from this incredible conversation that you want to leave with everyone here today, what would that be?
Oh, you asking me? I thought you were asking everybody who was watching.
I'm asking
Ask a
you.
question again. I was like, oh, everybody's gonna pump me up. Yes, go, ego. Sorry, what was the question again? What do I want to leave people with?
What is your one piece of wisdom, key
Yeah,
takeaway that you want to leave with the audience?
invest in social capital. Invest in social capital. I believe that investing in social capital and improving your emotional intelligence and improving your social skills is going to be the single biggest differentiator in business in the next decade. I think that investing in your own network by actually going to places, getting on planes, organizing dinners, being that ringleader, connecting people in your industry, in your target industries, I think that I just published an article, for example, about small talk and like two quick tricks to improve your small talk. I think improving in those types of skills, especially if you're like an awkward, short Jewish guy who's introverted like me, um, I think those are going to be uh, irreplaceable skills in a very rapidly approaching age where uh, knowledge is no longer scarce.
Amazing. Jonathan, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for sharing such incredible insights and strategies here. And on behalf of the Nasdaq Center, we are just so thankful that you joined us today.
Got it. It was a joy. Thank you.
Awesome. And to our audience, we'd love for you to join us again for upcoming webinars, which you can view using that link that's going to be posted in the chat. And thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you back online with us soon.